In 1914, inside the sprawling automotive assembly plants of the Ford Motor Company, a small piece of Canadian hardware was quietly altering the speed of industrial production. It was a cold-formed screw with a recessed square drive, manufactured in a red brick factory in Milton, Ontario. It did not slip, it did not strip, it did not cam out under the pressure of power drivers. Records suggest this single Milton export saved Henry Ford approximately 2 hours of assembly time per vehicle. It reduced wood damage. It prevented assembly line injuries. It was, by every mechanical measure, a flawless industrial fastener. Ford wanted it for every factory. He demanded the exclusive rights to manufacture the square drive screw in the United States. But the inventor sitting in Milton refused to surrender control of his patent. He would not license the manufacturing rights. He demanded that every screw be purchased directly from his Canadian plant. That single negotiation sealed the fate of the Robertson screwdriver. It created a profound industrial paradox. Inside Canada, the Robertson drive became the undisputed standard of the trades. Its color-coded handles, green, red, and black, would eventually populate every carpenter's belt, every logging camp workshop, and every hardware store aisle from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. It completely locked the American Phillips drive out of the domestic Canadian construction industry. But outside the Canadian border, the square drive was practically exiled. The Milton Empire secured its domestic dominance at the cost of global expansion. Decades later, the original Ontario production lines would halt, the foundational company would be absorbed by American corporate conglomerates, and the ultimate Canadian hand tool would be stripped of its independence. The perfect screw survived, but the Canadian tool-making empire behind it was slowly dismantled. Welcome back to the channel, where we document the rise and collapse of the tools, factories, and hardware systems that built this country. If you want to help preserve the history of Canadian industrial design and manufacturing, please subscribe. Now let us return to Milton, Ontario, long before the square drive entered the automotive assembly line. Before 1908, the Canadian workshop was bound by a fundamental mechanical flaw. The standard fastener of the era was the straight, slotted screw. It was a simple design, easily cut by early lathes, but it possessed a critical weakness. The driver blade sat loosely in the slot. When a carpenter applied torque, the blade inherently wanted to push itself out of the screw head. This mechanical rejection is known as cam out. For decades, cabinet makers in Ontario, boat builders in Nova Scotia, and mechanics in early Montreal automotive shops accepted cam out as an inevitable cost of doing business. They accepted the stripped screw heads. They accepted the gouged wood. They accepted the bloody knuckles. The Canadian manufacturing sector was rapidly accelerating toward mass production. The era of pure craftsmanship was giving way to the era of assembly lines. Yet this entire industrial system was held back by a fastener that could not be reliably driven at high speed. The slotted screw was a bottleneck on the factory floor. It required two hands to operate, one to hold the screw and one to turn the driver. If an early electric or pneumatic driver was applied to a slotted screw, the tool would violently jump from the slot, destroying the workpiece and stalling production. The Canadian industrial economy desperately needed a fastener that could handle immense rotational force without failing. The solution was born from physical injury. Peter Lymburner Robertson was a traveling salesman from Seneca Township, Ontario. By one account, he was demonstrating a spring-loaded screwdriver to a group of potential clients on the streets of Montreal. As he applied pressure, the flat blade violently slipped from the slotted screw. The steel drove deep into his hand. It was a severe cut, but it crystallized a mechanical truth. The straight slot was fundamentally obsolete. A recessed drive, a socket that could physically capture the tip of the screwdriver and lock it in place, was the only logical path forward for modern manufacturing. The concept of a square drive screw was not entirely new. European and American inventors had theorized it for years, but previous attempts had universally failed at the manufacturing stage. If a factory tried to cut, mill, or punch a square hole into a heated screw head, the surrounding metal would weaken. The corners of the square would easily strip out under the pressure of a screwdriver. The fastener would fail before the wood was clamped tight. Robertson's genius was not just the shape of the recess, but the precise method of forging it. He developed a proprietary cold-forming process. A hardened steel punch would strike the cold steel wire with immense force, simultaneously shaping the dome of the screw head and pressing the tapered square recess deep into the metal. Because the steel was not heated or cut, the cold-forming process heavily compressed the metal grain around the socket. It made the walls of the square recess drastically stronger than the surrounding metal. It was a flawless manufacturing method. It produced a screw that was virtually indestructible under normal torque. In 1908, Robertson patented his cold-formed square drive screw. He now needed a manufacturing base to scale his invention. He found it in Milton, Ontario, a growing industrial town west of Toronto. The town recognized the potential of his patent and offered a municipal loan, a tax exemption, and the necessary infrastructure to build a serious tool-making operation. The P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was officially established in a modest brick facility on Bronte Street. Getting the square drive screw into the Canadian market required overcoming massive industrial inertia. Factories across the country already possessed millions of slotted screws and thousands of flathead screwdrivers. Transitioning to a proprietary fastener meant changing entire workshop supply chains. Robertson aggressively marketed his invention directly to local tradesmen. The initial Canadian entry occurred through persistent demonstrations to local woodworkers and small-scale manufacturers in southern Ontario. When a Canadian carpenter tried the Robertson screw for the first time, they discovered a radical new capability. The slight taper of the square recess allowed the screw to physically cling onto the matching tip of the screwdriver. This friction fit, known as cling, meant a worker could place the screw on the driver, extend their arm, and drive the fastener into the wood using only one hand. They did not need to hold the screw. They could drive it upside down. They could drive it at awkward angles. The early reception in Canadian industrial circles was an absolute revelation. The T. Eaton Company, a titan of early Canadian retail and manufacturing, began using Robertson screws in their massive Toronto furniture factories to drastically speed up cabinet assembly. Early automotive bodybuilders, such as the Fisher Motor Company in Walkerville, Ontario, recognized that the square drive entirely eliminated the devastating paint scratches caused by slipping screwdrivers on assembly lines. Local hardware stores across Halton County began stocking the new fastener, and tradesmen quickly realized its superiority over anything imported from the United States or Great Britain. The Milton factory began running at capacity. Local hardware catalogs started dedicating space to the unusual square hole. The local trades had spoken. The Canadian workshop needed a fastener that would not slip, strip, or fail under pressure. P.L. Robertson had delivered it, and the stage was set for an unprecedented expansion into the very heart of North American heavy industry. The shift from a small Milton operation to a national industrial titan required more than just local word of mouth. It required a fundamental mechanical superiority that could be mathematically proven on a balance sheet. The physical architecture of the Robertson fastening system was deceptively simple, yet perfectly engineered for the realities of early 20th century mass production. The recess in the screw head was not a simple punch box. It was a carefully designed, slightly tapered square socket. The matching screwdriver tip featured the exact same precise taper. This specific geometry achieved two critical mechanical functions that the straight slotted screw could never replicate. First, the square drive distributed the rotational force evenly across the four interior walls of the screw head, rather than concentrating it entirely on a single thin, fragile slot. This massive increase in surface contact allowed workers to apply extreme torque without breaking the screw. Second, the slight taper created an interference fit. When the steel driver was pushed into the steel screw, the two pieces of metal physically wedged together. This mechanical wedge created cling. A mechanic or carpenter could load a fastener onto the driver tip, extend their arm, and swing the tool like a hammer without losing the screw. In the chaotic, cramped, and rapid environment of an assembly line, the ability to drive a fastener entirely with one hand was an industrial revelation. It freed the worker's second hand to hold the workpiece, position the material, or stabilize their own body. But a brilliant design is useless if it cannot be manufactured at scale. P.L. Robertson's ultimate Canadian moat was his proprietary cold-forming process. To create the perfect square recess, Raw, unheated steel wire was fed into massive, violently loud heading machines in the Milton factory. A hardened steel punch struck the wire with thousands of pounds of pressure, instantly forging the dome of the screw and driving the square hole deep into the center. Because the metal was not heated or cut, the cold-forming process heavily compressed the microscopic grain structure of the steel around the socket. It hardened the walls of the drive. It created a fastener that was virtually indestructible under the intense torque of industrial machinery. The Canadian price context was initially challenging. Robertson screws were slightly more expensive to manufacture per unit than traditional slotted screws. But for large-scale manufacturers, the raw cost of the fastener was irrelevant compared to the cost of human labor and damaged materials. The slotted screw was a liability. When a driver slipped from a slotted screw, the inevitable cam-out, it frequently gouged the surrounding wood, ruined finished surfaces, and slashed the hands of the workers. The Robertson screw eliminated cam-out. It eliminated the ruined dashboards. It eliminated the bloody knuckles. It eliminated the wasted hours spent extracting stripped fasteners. The ultimate breakthrough occurred when the Canadian automotive industry recognized this economic math. In Windsor, Ontario, the Ford Motor Company of Canada was rapidly expanding its assembly lines to meet the exploding demand for the Model T. Early automobiles were heavily constructed of wood. Their frames, floorboards, and interior structures required thousands of driven fasteners per vehicle. When Ford of Canada adopted the Milton-made square drive, the acceleration in production was staggering. Available reports indicate that the Robertson screw saved Ford assembly lines roughly 2 hours of labor per vehicle. In the high-volume, hyper-efficient world of automotive manufacturing, 2 hours of saved time was a monumental competitive advantage. The success in Windsor triggered a massive cascade across Canadian heavy industry. The Fisher Body Company in Walkerville, Ontario, which built the wooden bodies for numerous early automotive brands, placed massive orders with the Milton factory. The square drive allowed their workers to safely use early motorized and pneumatic driving tools, a process that was previously impossible with slotted screws. This industrial adoption quickly spread beyond the automotive sector. The Canadian Pacific Railway operated the colossal Angus shops in Montreal, Quebec. It was a sprawling industrial complex where thousands of wooden boxcars and passenger carriages were constructed. The Angus shops required a fastener that could withstand the intense, constant vibration of rail travel, yet be driven fast enough to keep up with rolling assembly quotas. They adopted the Robertson drive. The Russell Motor Car Company in Toronto integrated the fasteners into their production. The T. Eaton Company in Toronto, operating massive furniture manufacturing divisions to supply their national catalogs, transitioned their cabinet makers to the square drive. Suddenly, the Robertson screwdriver was no longer just an automotive assembly tool. It was bleeding out into the general Canadian trades. As thousands of factory workers used the square drive at work, they began demanding it for their own personal toolboxes. Plumbers, electricians, and carpenters across Ontario realized that their traditional slotted screwdrivers were obsolete. The Milton factory aggressively expanded its distribution network to meet this demand. They secured contracts with major Canadian hardware distributors and local mercantile stores. From Halifax to Vancouver, hardware shelves began stocking the distinctive square-tipped drivers alongside massive wooden crates of Robertson fasteners. P.L. Robertson had built a flawless industrial fortress. He held the patents. He controlled the proprietary cold-forming machinery. He dictated the manufacturing tolerances. He owned the Milton plant. He had successfully embedded his exact specific standard into the assembly lines of the nation's largest manufacturers and the toolboxes of the nation's independent tradesmen. The Canadian workshop was completely transformed, and the Robertson manufacturing empire was poised to enter an era of unprecedented glory. By the middle of the 20th century, the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was no longer just a successful local business. It was the gravitational center of the Canadian hardware industry. The original brick building on Bronte Street in Milton had metastasized into a sprawling, multi-acre industrial fortress. It was a self-contained empire of steel, noise, and constant production. The town of Milton essentially synchronized its daily rhythm to the factory whistle. Generations of Halton County families walked through the factory gates, manning the violent, deafening cold-heading machines that continuously punched raw steel wire into perfect square drive fasteners. The true scale of the Robertson Empire was forged during the Second World War. When the Canadian government mobilized its manufacturing sector for the war effort, the demand for reliable, high-speed fasteners skyrocketed. Slotted screws were a liability in wartime production. There was no time for stripped heads, delayed assembly, or gouged aluminum. The Milton factory became a critical military supplier. When Victory Aircraft in Malton, Ontario, began constructing the legendary de Havilland Mosquito bombers, aircraft famously built almost entirely of wood, they relied heavily on Robertson screws. The precise, slip-free drive was essential for assembling the delicate, high-stress wooden airframes without damaging the surrounding material. On the eastern coast, the sprawling Halifax shipyards in Nova Scotia utilized immense quantities of Milton fasteners to construct the wooden interiors and electrical panels of Royal Canadian Navy corvettes. The war effort required speed, standardization, and absolute reliability. P.L. Robertson delivered all three. The factory operated around the clock, churning out tens of millions of fasteners a month to feed the Canadian war machine. The square drive proved it could withstand the brutal conditions of military assembly lines just as flawlessly as it had conquered the Ford automotive plants decades earlier. When the war ended, the Milton plant did not slow down. It immediately pivoted to supply the greatest construction boom in Canadian history. The creation of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, triggered an unprecedented explosion of suburban development. Millions of new homes were built across Ontario, Quebec, and the western provinces. Every single one of those homes required hinges, floorboards, electrical boxes, cabinetry, and door frames. The Canadian construction industry universally standardized on the square drive. It was during this post-war explosion that the Robertson Empire codified its most brilliant and enduring cultural innovation, the color-coded handle system. To help tradesmen instantly identify the correct screwdriver size in a dark toolbox or a cluttered workbench, the Milton factory implemented a universal visual language. The number 0 drive, used for fine cabinet work, was assigned a yellow handle. The number 1 drive, the standard for hinges and smaller hardware, was given a green handle. The number 2 drive, the absolute workhorse of the Canadian construction industry, used for framing and general carpentry, received the iconic red handle. The heavy-duty number 3 drive, reserved for massive structural screws, was marked with a black handle. This color system bypassed the need to read small stamped numbers on a steel shank. A carpenter on a scaffold in Toronto could look down at his belt, see the red acetate handle, and instantly know he had the correct tool for the number 2 fastener in his hand. It was a triumph of Canadian industrial design. The yellow, green, red, and black handles became the unofficial flag of the Canadian tradesman. Trade schools across the country, from the vocational programs in Vancouver to the technical institutes in Montreal, exclusively taught their apprentices using Robertson drivers. A generation of Canadian carpenters, electricians, and plumbers learned their trade holding a Milton-made tool. They learned the feeling of the interference fit. They learned the speed of one-handed fastening. The straight slotted screwdriver was effectively banished from the professional Canadian job site, relegated to the bottom drawer, used only for prying open paint cans or scraping dried glue. The Canadian workshop had completely assimilated the square drive. It was no longer just a tool, it was an expectation. The retail conquest of the Canadian market was absolute. When a tradesman walked into a Canadian tire store in the 1970s, they were not looking for a generic fastener. They were looking for the iconic green cardboard boxes printed with the P.L. Robertson name. Entire aisles were dedicated to the Milton Empire. Massive pegboards displayed rows of acetate-handled screwdrivers, categorized strictly by the yellow, green, red, and black color system. The distribution network stretched from coast to coast. J.H. Ashdown Hardware in Winnipeg, the massive Western mercantile giant, shipped trainloads of Robertson fasteners across the prairies to supply agricultural repair shops and local hardware dealers. In St. Jacobs, Ontario, the newly formed Home Hardware Cooperative made the square drive a foundational pillar of its national inventory. The Eaton's and Sears Canada catalogs prominently featured Robertson driver sets in their tool sections. ensuring that even the most remote farming communities in Saskatchewan had direct access to the slip-free technology. The Milton factory had evolved into a massive, highly optimized industrial ecosystem. By the late 20th century, the Bronte Street plant employed hundreds of local workers. The production floor was a deafening expanse of mechanical power. Massive spools of raw Canadian steel wire were fed into batteries of cold-heading machines. The headers punched the square recess, the thread rollers violently pressed the helical threads into the shanks, and massive heat-treating furnaces hardened the metal to exact specifications. The statistics of this era represent the absolute peak of Canadian toolmaking scale. Industry estimates suggest the Milton facility was manufacturing over 1 billion fasteners annually. The square drive commanded approximately 85% of the domestic wood screw market. It was an unprecedented domestic monopoly built entirely on mechanical superiority. The American Phillips screw, the cross-recess design that had completely conquered the United States construction industry, was effectively quarantined at the Canadian border. It was used in imported American appliances and automobiles, but it was universally despised by Canadian tradesmen. American carpenters accepted the frustrating, destructive reality of cam-out. Canadian carpenters did not have to. The square drive found its way into highly specialized Canadian industries. The recreational vehicle and mobile home manufacturers in Alberta relied on Robertson screws because the extreme vibration of highway transport would violently shake slotted or Phillips screws loose. The deep, tight interference fit of the Milton square drive locked the wooden frames together permanently. Electricians wiring the massive hydroelectric dams in Quebec relied on the long-shank Robertson drivers to securely fasten terminal blocks inside deep electrical panels without dropping the hardware into the machinery. This was the peak of the Canadian workshop experience. To reach into a leather tool pouch and pull out a red-handled Robertson screwdriver was to hold a flawless piece of domestic engineering. It was a tool that solved a universal industrial problem, manufactured entirely within the borders of Ontario, distributed through national retail networks, and driven into the spruce frames of millions of Canadian homes. P.L. Robertson had built a self-sustaining industrial loop. The Milton factory had achieved total market saturation. Every framing crew in Calgary, every boatyard in Halifax, and every assembly line in Windsor relied on the precise, tapered geometry of the square recess. It was a domestic empire without equal, but this massive scale masked a fatal vulnerability. The entire Robertson operation was perfectly optimized to feed a single, isolated market. The fortress was impenetrable from the inside, but it was entirely cut off from the global economy. The perfect screw had conquered the nation, but the decisions of the past had guaranteed it would never conquer the world. The collapse of the Milton toolmaking empire was not triggered by a failure of engineering. It was triggered by a fatal miscalculation of industrial leverage. The systemic fracture of the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company did not begin in the late 20th century. The turning point occurred decades earlier, precisely at the moment the square drive was poised to conquer the American automotive industry. By all historical accounts, Henry Ford recognized the absolute mechanical superiority of the cold-form square drive. His early Canadian assembly lines in Windsor had proven that the Milton fastener saved immense amounts of labor, prevented material damage, and vastly improved production speed. Ford wanted to standardize the entire Ford Motor Company, the largest industrial manufacturing system on the planet, on the Robertson fastener. But Ford demanded supply security. The American industrial machine could not rely on a single independent factory in Ontario to feed its global assembly lines. A border dispute, a railway strike, or a catastrophic fire at the Milton plant could paralyze Ford's entire automotive production. Therefore, Ford demanded the rights to license the patent. He wanted to manufacture the square drive screws in his own factories or license multiple American steel mills to produce them simultaneously. P.L. Robertson refused. He had previously suffered a disastrous licensing agreement in Great Britain, an ordeal where he temporarily lost control of his patents, his capital, and his international manufacturing rights. That European failure left him fiercely protective of his proprietary cold-forming process. He refused to license the manufacturing rights to anyone. He demanded that Henry Ford purchase the fasteners directly from the Milton plant, or through a wholly owned subsidiary that Robertson completely controlled. Ford withdrew, The Ford Motor Company would not be held hostage by a Canadian supplier. The negotiation collapsed, and with it, the single greatest opportunity for Canadian hand tool dominance in history. This refusal created a massive vacuum in the American industrial market. The United States manufacturing sector desperately needed a recess-driven screw to replace the obsolete slotted fastener. In the 1930s, an American businessman named Henry F. Phillips provided the solution. He patented the crosshead drive. Mechanically, the Phillips drive was fundamentally inferior to the Robertson for manual trade work. It possessed sloping internal walls specifically designed to cam out. It was engineered to forcefully eject the screwdriver tip to prevent automated heavy torque assembly machines from over-tightening the fastener. It damaged the screw head by design. It required intense forward pressure to keep the driver engaged. It was everything the Canadian square drive had successfully eliminated. But Henry F. Phillips understood the systemic power of corporate licensing. Phillips did not want to build a sprawling factory. He did not want to manufacture screws. He simply wanted to license the crosshead design to every massive steel mill and fastener factory in the United States. General Motors adopted the Phillips drive for the 1936 Cadillac assembly lines. The American military adopted it to standardize wartime production. The United States hardware market completely surrendered to the crosshead design. The Canadian tool-making empire was permanently locked out of the largest consumer and industrial market on Earth. The perfect square drive was effectively quarantined north of the 49th parallel. For decades, the sheer, overwhelming volume of the domestic Canadian construction boom masked this fatal vulnerability. The Milton factory was running at maximum capacity. The green, red, and black handles were dominating Canadian tire shelves, but a tool empire cannot survive indefinitely on a single isolated market. This isolation created a frustrating, bifurcated reality for the Canadian tradesman. Because the United States had standardized on Phillips, every imported American automobile, refrigerator, industrial machine, and consumer appliance sold in Canada was assembled with crosshead screws. Canadian mechanics and electricians were forced to carry both systems. They used their beloved, flawless Robertson drivers for domestic construction, and they reluctantly used their Phillips drivers to repair the endless flood of American imports. In 1951, P.L. Robertson died. The visionary founder who had transformed a small brick building on Bronte Street into a national industrial titan was gone. The family company continued operating, maintaining its absolute domestic monopoly throughout the 1950s and 1960s. However, without its fiercely independent founder, the company slowly transitioned from an engineering-driven fortress into a vulnerable corporate asset. The economic foundations of Canadian manufacturing were beginning to shift. The cost of raw Canadian steel was rising. The cost of unionized Canadian labor in Halton County was increasing. The massive overheadery of the TransUnion Corporation, headquartered in Chicago. After 60 years of fiercely protecting its domestic autonomy, the Milton factory was suddenly answering to an American board of directors. The tool-making fortress was no longer an independent vision. It was a line item on an international corporate balance sheet. Of running the sprawling Bronte Street plant required constant, immense, uninterrupted volume. Simultaneously, the global retail landscape was consolidating. Canadian hardware chains were evolving into massive corporate entities. They were fiercely competing on price, and they began demanding lower wholesale costs from their domestic suppliers. The Milton factory was suddenly facing intense margin pressure. It was a massive facility, producing a premium, flawless fastener in a high-cost Canadian manufacturing environment, trapped inside a single country. The Canadian tool-making fortress was completely surrounded. The corporate conglomerates were circling, and the original independence of the Milton Empire was about to be permanently broken. In 1968, the era of total independence officially ended. The P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was acquired by Procore Limited, a massive Canadian industrial firm. However, Procore itself was a subsidiary. This corporate absorption initiated a slow, systemic dismantling of the Canadian manufacturing loop. The new ownership structure stripped the company of its agility. For decades, the Robertson brand was passed between holding companies and massive conglomerates. By the late 20th century, it was absorbed into the Marmon Group, an immense industrial empire that would eventually become a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway. The foundational identity of the Canadian hand tool industry was now controlled by American financial executives who evaluated the Milton plant strictly on its profit margins. Those profit margins were facing an existential threat from overseas. The original patents that had protected the precise geometry of the square drive had long expired. When the global trade barriers began to fall in the 1980s and 1990s, foreign fastener manufacturers recognized a massive vulnerability in the Canadian market. The Canadian workshop demanded square drive screws, but the modern Canadian retail system demanded lower prices. Steel mills and foundries in Taiwan and China began flooding the Canadian borders with cheap, generic square drive fasteners. They did not call them Robertson screws. They labeled them as square recess or screw locks drives. These imported fasteners were fundamentally inferior. The offshore foundries did not utilize P.L. Robertson's proprietary cold-forming machinery. They simply stamped or punched a square hole into cheap, heated, soft steel. They ignored the highly specific, microscopic taper of the inner walls. Without that precise taper, there was no interference fit. Without the interference fit, there was no mechanical cling. When a modern Canadian carpenter reached into a bulk bin at a massive big box hardware store and loaded a generic offshore screw onto their driver, the magic of the Milton design was completely gone. The screw wobbled on the tip. It fell off the driver. When heavy torque was applied, the soft, stamped steel yielded. The corners of the square recess instantly stripped out into a useless circle. The generic imports behaved exactly like the flawed, destructive fasteners that P.L. Robertson had eradicated a century earlier. But the modern hardware retail system prioritized volume and inventory cost over flawless mechanical geometry. The massive retail chains, Home Depot, Rona, and the modernized Canadian Tire, began allocating their primary shelf space to bulk bins of cheap imported, generic square drive fasteners. The original, authentic Robertson boxes were pushed to the premium aisles. The Milton factory was suddenly forced to compete on price against massive Asian industrial complexes that possessed a fraction of the labor and material costs. The American corporate ownership of the Robertson brand analyzed this brutal retail math. Operating a massive unionized steel facility in Halton County, Ontario, was deemed economically inefficient. The cost of Canadian steel, Canadian electricity, and Canadian manufacturing labor could not be reconciled with the retail demand for cheap hardware. To survive the retail price war, the corporate ownership executed the ultimate retreat. The company began systematically outsourcing its manufacturing. The authentic Robertson brand survived. The precise engineering specifications were maintained on their premium lines. The iconic green cardboard boxes remained on the shelves, but the steel inside those boxes was no longer forged on Bronte Street. The production was slowly shifted to massive fastener factories in China. The core physical reality of the Canadian toolmaking empire was quietly hollowed out. The town of Milton was rapidly changing. The sprawling agricultural lands surrounding the factory were being paved over. The town was transforming into a massive commuter suburb for the Greater Toronto area. The local economy no longer required an industrial anchor. The massive footprint of the Bronte Street plant became far more valuable as commercial real estate than as a functioning tool factory. The corporate retreat accelerated. The massive cold-heading machines were powered down. The workforce was drastically reduced. The deafening roar of Canadian steel wire being violently punched into perfect, square drives faded away. The factory whistle stopped blowing. The local supply chain collapsed. The Milton gates were locked. The original brick buildings were abandoned. The manufacturing lines stopped. The machines were dismantled. The workforce was dismissed. The factory floor was silenced. The domestic empire folded. Today, the P.L. Robertson brand still survives in the Canadian retail landscape. You can walk into any hardware store from St. John's to Victoria and find the iconic green cardboard packaging resting on the shelves. But the corporate entity operating under that famous name is a hollow reflection of the original Milton empire. The modern brand is a heavily managed subsidiary of a massive American holding company. The vast majority of the steel inside those modern green boxes is no longer forged in Ontario. It is stamped, pressed, and shipped from massive industrial foundries in Asia. The company that invented the cold-form square drive is now largely an importer of its own legacy. Yet across the Canadian provinces, a quiet, stubborn preservation movement exists. It is not organized in formal museums or historical societies, but inside the battered metal toolboxes of veteran carpenters, retired machinists, and heritage woodworkers. There is an active, deeply committed community of Canadian tool collectors who refuse to purchase modern, outsourced drivers. They spend their weekends hunting through flea markets in Aberfoyle, estate sales in rural Ontario, and agricultural auctions in the prairies. They are searching for the original cellulose acetate handles. They know the distinct, slightly acidic smell of aging vintage plastic. They look for the specific, deeply stamped letters, PLR, on the hardened steel shank. They separate the genuine Milton production from the modern generic imports. They seek these original Canadian drivers because the mechanical truth of 1908 remains entirely valid today. An original, cold-formed Robertson screwdriver possesses a physical exactness that modern, mass-produced generic tools simply cannot replicate. When a Canadian carpenter slides a vintage, red-handled No. 2 driver into an original cold-formed Milton screw, the mechanical magic instantly returns. The interference fit is absolute. The cling is undeniable. A worker can hold the tool horizontally, aggressively shake the handle, and the steel fastener will not drop. The tool becomes a seamless extension of the worker's arm. It is a physical reminder of an era when a manufacturer prioritized the flawless completion of the task over the fractional reduction of retail costs. The steel does not yield. The wood does not strip. The design works perfectly. There is a profound, almost tragic irony in the global legacy of the square drive. More than a century after Henry Ford aggressively rejected P.L. Robertson's strict manufacturing terms, the American industrial sector is finally realizing what the Canadian trades intuitively knew in 1908. High-end custom cabinet makers, specialized architectural builders, and fine furniture craftsmen in the United States have quietly abandoned the Phillips drive. They are currently importing millions of specialized fasteners to assemble their premium woodworking projects. Massive American tool companies have built entire modern woodworking systems, such as specialized pocket-hole joinery jigs, entirely around the exact same square recess that Robertson invented. They are adopting the identical mechanical geometry that Ford walked away from. However, because the original patents expired decades ago, the American market rarely refers to it by the name of the Ontario traveling salesman. They simply call it a square recess or a pocket-hole screw. The Canadian invention finally conquered the American workshop, but the Canadian tool-making empire received none of the credit and none of the capital. If you drive into Milton, Ontario today, the physical evidence of this colossal industrial achievement is practically erased. The town is no longer an isolated, self-sustaining manufacturing powerhouse. It has been absorbed into the sprawling, affluent commuter belt of the Greater Toronto Area. The vast geographic footprint of the original Bronte Street factory has been irreversibly fragmented. The massive, thick brick walls that once vibrated with the deafening, earth-shaking thunder of cold-heading machinery have been heavily redeveloped or demolished. Where generations of Halton County families once stood over glowing heat-treating furnaces to forge the perfect industrial fastener, there are now modern commercial retail plazas, commuter parking lots, and quiet suburban streets. The factory whistle that once dictated the daily rhythm of an entire Canadian county has been permanently silenced. The knowledge of the machinists, the skill of the tool and die makers, and the raw industrial capability of the plant have completely evaporated. The Canadian manufacturing loop is permanently broken. The story of the Robertson screwdriver is the ultimate paradox of Canadian industrial design. It was a flawless, revolutionary invention that successfully solved a universal mechanical failure. It conquered the Canadian workshop through sheer, undeniable engineering superiority. It protected the hands of the workers, it accelerated the assembly of the nation, and it became an enduring cultural symbol of domestic craftsmanship. But an industrial tool empire cannot survive indefinitely on engineering alone. It requires massive, aggressive global scale. It requires immense international leverage. It requires the ruthlessness to dictate terms to a globalized market. P.L. Robertson built the perfect tool, but he built it inside an impenetrable domestic fortress. When those fortress walls were eventually breached by shifting supply chains, relentless corporate consolidation, and the brutal math of globalized big-box retail, the manufacturing system rapidly collapsed, even as the tool itself survived. The Milton factory is gone, the American conglomerates own the brand, and the offshore foundries forge the steel. But inside a freezing, unheated garage in rural Saskatchewan, an original, deeply scratched red-handled screwdriver still hangs above a heavy wooden workbench, waiting for the next generation to grip the handle and turn the screw. See you in the next one.